Welcome back to Conflicts of Interest. This is episode 834, and today is September 8th, 2025. I'm the host of the show, Kyle Anzalone. A lot of news to get through on today's show, but before we get into that, need to mention the sponsor of the show, and that is the Expat Money Summit 2025. Mikkel Thorpe and his great team over at the Expat Money Summit put on this conference once a year where they go over how you can move your money, your finances, and even yourself abroad, developing a plan B in case something really goes bad in the United States. Having a second passport, having somewhere to go, having finances offshore can all be hugely important to getting you and your family out safely. And so the Expat Money Summit is going to help you develop your plan B, figure out where you could purchase property offshore outside the United States, the laws around that. Mikkel and his team will help you do that, and you could learn all about that at the Expat Money Summit 2025 conference. The website is expatmoneysummit.com, and you could just go and get yourself a free ticket. But if you're really interested in the event, if you want to be able to go and watch back all the free panels, you can absolutely do that. When you buy a VIP ticket, even better, when you buy a VIP ticket, you get access to all the exclusive panels, including the one that I will be on. And so once again, you can get access to the VIP Summit with my panel when you get a VIP ticket and you use the promo code Kyle at KYLE, all caps, at checkout. That is the promo code. It will save you 20% off your purchase. And with that, let's jump right into today's episode. All right, so the first story that we have up here today is one I wrote for JudgeNap.com on September 7th. Trump tells Congress the U.S. has started an open-ended military operation in Venezuela. President Donald Trump sent a letter to the leaders of the House and Senate explaining his reason for striking a boat in the South Caribbean and said he did not know how long the U.S. would continue strikes against cartels in Venezuela. The letter to House Speaker Mike Johnson and Senate Majority Leader John Thune said, to address the continuing threat to the United States, persons and interests emanating from their territories, we now have reached a critical point where we must meet this threat to our citizens and our most vital natural interests with the United States military force and self-defense. And so they're launching an aggressive war here. They're declaring that certain cartels are terrorist organizations and then bombing them, and now they're claiming that's in self-defense. While that's completely ridiculous, while this is absolutely outside of the U.S. Constitution, I am at no surprise here. The U.S. government for years has eroded away, and the presidency has creepingly usurped more and more war powers to unilaterally declare war. And so when this happens, it's almost no surprise that in Washington, they don't really think about it. They don't debate. This is not a major scandal. They're not calling for Trump's impeachment. Right, he's declared an illegal war. No motions for impeachment here. So this is the most important part of the letter, I think. So it says, accordingly, at my direction on September 2nd, 2025, the United States forces struck a vessel at a location beyond the territorial seas of any nation that was assessed to be affiliated with a designated terrorist organization and to be engaged in illicit drug trafficking. And then it adds, it is not possible at this time to know the full scope and duration of military operations that will be necessary. The United States forces remain postured to carry out further military operations. And so, the Trump administration isn't just saying here that, this was a one-off strike from some unique threat, but rather this is a part of ongoing military operations. And I think it's very possible that these military operations are going to significantly escalate. We're not only going to see strikes in international waters, but actually on Venezuelan sovereign territory. This next article, again, JudgeNap.com, September 7th. Of course, the articles I write for JudgeNap.com are available on his website to members. You can also find them on my X account at KyleAnzalone_. We are really creeping up on 10,000 followers. That is 5 digits. Very excited to hit that milestone. And so if you haven't already, head on over to my X account and subscribe again at @KyleAnzalone_. This article, U.S. moves F-35s to Puerto Rico as Trump considers strikes in Venezuela. The White House appears to be preparing for a significant military escalation against Venezuela. Last week, the U.S. conducted a lethal strike against a boat near Venezuela, killing 11. President Donald Trump is considering bombing alleged cartel targets inside Venezuela, according to sources speaking with CNN. The report comes as the Pentagon has moved 10 F-35s to Puerto Rico. Over the past month, the U.S. has engaged in a large-scale military buildup in the Caribbean, including fighter jets, warships, thousands of Marines, and an attack submarine. Additionally, top American officials have threatened Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro, although on Friday, Trump said he was not considering regime change in Caracas. However, a source speaking with CNN said the White House does want Maduro to give up power. The source explained, the preferred course of action is for Maduro to leave on his own to read the tea leaves. And then I think the message is, do you want this easy or do you want this to be hard? The State Department claims Maduro is the leader of our cartel that has been designated as a narco-terrorist organization. Trump has recently given the Department of War, the recently renamed Department of War, the authorization to target blacklisted cartels. Last week, Trump approved the Pentagon to strike a boat after it departed Venezuela. The U.S. claims the attack killed 11 members of a narco-terror cartel. I'm unsure about that as to who exactly was on that boat. If we get some good information, I will bring that to you guys. Maduro has warned Trump against attacking Venezuela. He has already begun mobilizing Venezuela's military. Caracas may be able to field as many as 8 million armed men. And so that would be a significant and difficult operation if the U.S. really did want to go in and try to overthrow Maduro. All right, so next up here, this one I wrote for September 4th at the Libertarian Institute. U.S. adds 2 Ecuadorian gangs to the list of narco-terrorist organizations. Secretary of State Marco Rubio has designated Los Chorros and Los Lobos as terror organizations after meeting with the Ecuadorian president. So a State Department press release on Thursday explained, today, Secretary Rubio announced the designations of the cartels as foreign terrorist organizations and specially designated global terrorists. The announcement followed a meeting between the Ecuadorian president and Rubio. The Ecuadorian president embraced the prospect of the U.S. taking action against the designated gangs. He said the cartels can keep believing that no one touches them, but the reality is different. They have been declared terrorist or groups by the United States. With their support, we will remain firm in our fight and to recover our country. About a dozen Latin American cartels have been placed on the terrorism list. President Donald Trump has authorized the military to conduct lethal attacks against the gangs. So reports say the Department of War is preparing to carry out raids and strikes inside Mexico and Venezuela. Mexico City and Caracas have both expressed opposition to the U.S. conducting military operations within their borders. And very disturbingly, a White House official speaking with Axios has said that the administration was considering a regime change operation similar to the 1989 invasion and regime change in Panama there. So highly concerning with something like the arrest of Noriega. All right, moving on now to the war in Ukraine. First story here is from our friend Dave DeCamp over at antiwar.com. Apologies, I had the wrong article loaded up there. The actual first article on the Ukraine section is one that I wrote for the Libertarian Institute on September 4th. UK Prime Minister says coalition of the willing could send long-range missiles to Ukraine. So a group of Western nations led by the UK and France is planning to further apply pressure on Russian President Vladimir Putin by sending long-range missiles to Ukraine. Following a meeting of the Coalition of the Willing Leaders on Thursday, a readout from UK Prime Minister Keir Starmer's office said, discussing the latest military planning for the Coalition of the Willing, the Prime Minister emphasized the group had an unbreakable pledge to Ukraine with President Trump's backing, and it was now clear they needed to get even further to apply pressure to Putin to secure a cessation of hostilities. The Prime Minister also welcomed an announcement from the Coalition of the Willing Partners to supply long-range missiles to Ukraine to further bolster the country's supplies. The Coalition of the Willing is a group of 31 Western countries led by the UK and France with the goal of arming Ukraine in its war against Russia. In recent weeks, Ukraine has attacked energy infrastructure. The State Department recently approved the sale of 3,350 ERAM long-range cruise missiles to Ukraine. While Europe will pay for some of the missiles, the U.S. will also provide funding for the munitions. The Coalition of the Willing Summit was held in Paris with Ukrainian President Zelensky attending. Emmanuel Macron, the French president, said attendees at the meeting discussed security guarantees for Ukraine post-war. He wrote on X, "The coalition volunteers made real progress in Paris, united for Ukraine. We are ready for lasting peace with strong security guarantees." Starmer said the group discussed deploying troops to Ukraine once the fighting stops. The coalition engaged in rapid work to ensure a force could deploy in the event of a ceasefire, the readout explains. However, Russian President Vladimir Putin said he would not agree to any peace deal that includes Western troop deployments to Ukraine. And so that's very important. This next story is very interesting. Maybe the most interesting story I have for y'all today. U.S. could play a role in monitoring future Ukraine demilitarized zone. And so, again, the proposal that so post-Alaska summit, which was August 15th, we had the Ukrainians and the Europeans really driving this idea, really pushing for this idea of Western security guarantees for Ukraine post-war. Now, in a vague sense, I don't think that's necessarily a deal breaker. Say if Poland, Romania, Slovakia, any Eastern European country wanted to sign a mutual defense pact with Russia, that might be something Russia was willing to accept. Now, once that includes Germany, the UK, France, and particularly the US, Kremlin's less likely to accept that. Additionally, those security guarantees would come with the West deploying between 50 and 100,000 troops to Ukraine post-war. That is certainly going to cross a Russian red line. And so this article from NBC News sounds like even if this new position isn't something that Russia is necessarily going to accept, it's certainly more in the direction of a deal that could see an end to the Ukraine war. So, the U.S. military may take a leading role in securing a buffer zone in Ukraine once a peace deal with Russia is reached. Multiple sources speaking with NBC said the U.S. could lead the surveillance of a future demilitarized zone to help secure Ukraine post-war. Under the plan, no American troops will deploy to Ukraine, and the ground presence will be led by non-NATO countries such as Saudi Arabia. Bangladesh was also mentioned. Now, I think a small-ish, like I'm not saying 100 troops, but say a couple thousand troops versus 100,000, and then from non-NATO states going to Ukraine post-war may be something Russia would be willing to accept. I believe there are earlier parts of the war where Russia had floated, or somebody had floated, and Russia responded positively to the idea that China could deploy a peacekeeping force to Ukraine post-war. Now, there is certainly a difference for Russia in the relationship with China versus Saudi Arabia. Arguably, maybe outside of Belarus and North Korea, Russia's closest international relationship, and maybe even with those countries included, Russia's closest international relationship is with China. Now, Russia has, I would say, good ties and economic ties with Saudi Arabia. And so, this may be something that could be acceptable to both sides. A country that has good relationships with the U.S. and Russia deploying the peacekeeping force. Again, I'm not necessarily saying I think Russia will accept this. I just think this plan is going to be far more close to what Russia is willing to accept than the offer we had just talked about in the Coalition of the Willing article. So under the plan, some European countries may agree to provide Ukraine with bilateral security guarantees. However, those assurances will be outside of NATO's Mutual Defense Pact. And so the way I understand it is that, let's say Poland signs a deal with Ukraine, it's a Mutual Defense Pact. Russia invades Ukraine. Poland sends troops to Ukraine. Those Polish troops come under fire by Russian forces. That would not invoke NATO's Article 5 pact. Now, I think from the Russian perspective, this is going to be more of a political decision of the time of the potential future conflict versus what the pact actually says, right? Like, if the U.S. doesn't want to get involved in a war, NATO's Article 5 can't necessarily force the U.S. to do that. It's more based on the political temperature of the United States. And so in our current political climate, I think it's very likely that if there's a Russian invasion of Ukraine, Poland sends troops, those troops are attacked by Russia, that there would be a significant presence in Washington that says that this is a declaration of war. We have to invoke NATO's Article 5, and so we are now at war with Russia. Again, I think there's just a large enough contingent in Washington right now that would force the president, whether Trump, Biden, Kamala, whoever, Gavin Newsom, the next Democrat's going to be, would likely be forced into that decision. And so I think this is more based on the political climate in the U.S., but this has the broad outlines to me of a deal that Russia would be highly, highly interested in. So, resolving the issue of security guarantees for Ukraine is just one of the barriers to ending the war. Additionally, Kiev is refusing to cede any territory to Russia, and Putin is demanding significant portions of Ukraine's east and south. On the campaign trail, Trump was confident he could bring the war to a quick end. However, he has been unable to push Putin off his hardline position, and Trump has failed to use his significant leverage over Kiev to compel Zelensky to make concessions. In a sign that the war could continue to drag on for some time, the Pentagon is in talks with Ukraine on a deal to send $100 billion in U.S. weapons. Under the proposed agreement, Kiev would give Washington intellectual property rights over weapons developed in Ukraine and receive arms for U.S. compensation. So, as much as the first 90% of this article I thought was a positive sign that we could be moving closer to an end to the war in Ukraine, this is highly troubling. As I've said since the very beginning, I think the threat with Donald Trump is, even if he doesn't want to have the U.S. fund in the conventional sense the war in Ukraine, there are very easy ways to drag the president in, to get the president to continue to send weapons to Ukraine. He just has to believe that the American government isn't going to be paying for them again in the conventional aid sense. And so we've had things like the mineral deals. This, Ukraine is going to give the U.S. partial ownership over future mining companies that exist in Ukraine. And you're going to take 50% ownership of a country. Let's say Ukraine says the company of a company, not a country, excuse me. Let's say Kiev says that company is valued at $2 billion. The U.S. gets half ownership. That's $1 billion value. Now, that company isn't currently mining. That mine isn't developed. They believe the resources are there. Those resources may end up in Russian territory one day. Russia may seize that territory. And so the U.S. will, never recognize profits off of that. But at the same time, it's a back end to effectively send Ukraine weapons on the U.S. dime with Trump thinking he's gained something in return, so it's not aid, right? This is a way to deceive Donald Trump, and I think we're going to see that again with this next stance. Now, one thing that could happen here is, of course, Donald Trump is a relatively, he changes his mind a lot. And so, and he goes off of emotion. And Zelensky is not that great at handling Trump. He had some remarks to ABC News that I think Trump might take exception to, so we'll see what the fallout from this is. This article I wrote on September 7th for the Libertarian Institute. Zelensky, it's a pity Trump gave Putin what he wanted with the Alaska summit. So Ukrainian President Zelensky criticized President Trump for giving Russian President Putin what he wanted during the Alaskan summit. In an interview with ABC, Zelensky said, "It's a pity that Ukraine was not there because I think that President Trump gave Putin what he wanted. He wanted very much to meet with President Trump, with the President of the United States, and I think that Putin got it, and it's a pity." Last month, Putin traveled to Alaska for an hours-long meeting with Trump. The following day, Trump met with Zelensky and European leaders in Washington. Zelensky claimed the meeting with Trump was a public relations victory. Putin doesn't want to meet with me, but he very much wants to meet with the President of the United States to show everybody video and images that he is there. While the summit was presented by both leaders as a success, Zelensky and Putin remain far apart on key issues that must be resolved to end the conflict. Trump is supporting Western security guarantees for Ukraine that Russia has ruled out as a part of any peace deal. The president made ending the war in Ukraine one of his core issues as a candidate. Last week, Trump admitted that ending the conflict has been more difficult than he expected. So, I think two more stories here kind of dealing with the Russia issue. The first one I wrote for the Institute on September 4th. Trump tells Europe to put economic pressure on China. In a call with European leaders and Ukrainian President Zelensky, President Trump demanded Europe place economic pressure on China to punish Beijing for continuing to trade with Russia. So, following the call, the White House gave a statement to Fox News. President Trump emphasized that Europe must stop purchasing Russian oil that is funding the war, as Russia received $1.3 billion in fuel sales from the EU in 1 year. The president also emphasized that European leaders must place economic pressure on China for funding Russia's war efforts. The call occurred during a coalition of the willing meeting hosted by France. The coalition comprises 31 countries that provide military support to Ukraine. The U.S. is not a member of the British and French-led group of nations. A White House official says Trump took the call at the request of French President Emmanuel Macron. Following the meeting, London said the coalition discussed sending long-range missiles to Ukraine to increase pressure on Russian President Vladimir Putin. Trump has recently taken aim at the growing relationship between Russia, China, and other countries outside of the U.S. control. Earlier this week, China hosted a meeting of world leaders to commemorate the 80th anniversary of World War II. Trump responded to the gathering by ranting on Truth Social. He posted, "The big question to be answered is whether or not President Xi of China will mention the massive amount of support and blood that the United States of America gave to China in order to help it secure its freedom from that very unfriendly foreign invader. Many Americans died in China's quest for victory and glory. I hope they are rightfully honored and remembered for their bravery and sacrifice. May President Xi and the wonderful people of China have a great and lasting day of celebration. Please give my warmest regards to Vladimir Putin and Kim Jong-un as you conspire against the United States of America." Along with China, Trump has sought economic penalties on India for trading with Russia. Last week, Trump increased tariffs on India to 50%. Indian Prime Minister Modi was one of the world leaders in China this week. And so a real follow-up on that is this article I wrote for antiwar.com on September 5th. And by the way, guys, I do write articles at antiwar.com, the Libertarian Institute, and judgenap.com every week. If that's a lot of sources to keep up with, just a reminder, they are all published on my Eds account at @KyleAnzalone_. So, President Donald Trump posted on his Truth Social account that India and Russia are now firmly tied to China and have drifted away from the U.S. orbit. Trump also demanded that Europe end Russian oil imports and put pressure on China. So we already covered that part of this story. But this next part is what Trump wrote on Truth Social on Friday. Looks like we've lost India and Russia to the deepest, darkest China. May they have a long and prosperous future together. Now, I think this is really important to just highlight how insanely stupid this is. The U.S. has been moving to incorporate India into the quadrilateral group of nations, which is the U.S., India, Japan, Australia, and it's this massive anti-China bloc that we're building for the coming future war against China. Now, really, all we had to do to keep that in place was to not punish India over its economic ties to Russia, which we want to do because of the war in Ukraine. And so Trump, by making the decision to start placing tariffs on India, has really driven the Indians into the hands of the arms of the Chinese. You know, this is like a situation where you got an abusive father and he beats the children and then blames his ex-wife for turning his children against him. You know, all you got to do is not beat the children and they're going to like you. In this case, all you have to do is not punish the Indians for doing business that is core to their economy, and they're going to keep doing business with you. But if you cut off the Indians, yes, they are going to develop deeper ties with China, with Russia, and this growing block of nations that are all kicked out of the U.S. world orbit. Venezuela, Cuba, Syria, formerly Syria, I guess now that they're a terrorist-led state, not so much. Yemen, Iran, Russia, China, North Korea, India now. This growing block of countries, it's not that China has conspired to form an alternative world order and to take over for the U.S., but rather it has been the U.S. kicking all these countries out of our world orbit, and now they're all saying, well, this is a pretty good and pretty growing and a pretty sizable chunk of the world economy, and a lot of the non-aligned countries are going to, you know, the countries that aren't firmly in the U.S. camp, South Africa, Brazil, some of the very rich Gulf Arab states, Qatar, the UAE, Saudi Arabia, are all willing and saying that, hey, you know, we would rather straddle the line than be firmly in the U.S. camp. So there is a sizable portion of the global economy that is going to be doing business outside the U.S. orbit now, and this is going to limit Washington's power and influence. It's not necessarily a bad thing in the sense of the U.S. influence being limited, but I think it's something of a, you know, setback, and probably bring the U.S. some economic pain as the world economy kind of reorients to the U.S. not being the world hegemon. All right, next up, this article from September 7th. Israel claims recognizing Palestinian state will destabilize the region. Israel's foreign minister said a plan by the UN members to recognize a Palestinian state is a mistake and will result in Tel Aviv taking unilateral action. Over the summer, countries including the UK and France announced plans to support Palestine's bid to become a UN member state. On Sunday, the Israeli foreign minister, Gideon Saar, asserted that recognition of Palestine will destabilize the region. He said states like France and the UK that pushed the so-called recognition have made a tremendous mistake. It will destabilize the region. It will push Israel to also have unilateral decisions. Saar went on to argue that the UN making Palestine a member state will make it harder to achieve peace. While the foreign minister did not explain what unilateral action Tel Aviv might take, top Israeli officials had discussed annexing parts of the West Bank. Additionally, Finance Minister Bezalel Smotrich announced a planned settlement expansion in the West Bank that will bisect the Palestinian territory. Smotrich claims the settlement will bury the idea of a Palestinian state. London and Paris made the decision to recognize Palestine as a response to the Israeli-created famine in Gaza. When the UN General Assembly reconvenes later this month, the body is expected to vote on making Palestine a member. Saar went on to explain that Israel only supports the creation of a Palestinian state under strict conditions, and therefore it comes with a lot of preconditions. A disarmed Palestinian state recognizing Israel, transparency, and democracy, that is our position. And of course, no country that is currently living under military occupation is going to only agree to have a state when that military occupying power is the only military force in the region. They're going to want their own military presence. All right, now getting to the story from our friend over at antiwar.com, Dave DeCamp. Israeli military claims it controls 40% of Gaza City. The Israeli military said on Thursday its forces already control 40% of Gaza City as it continues its heavy bombardment and ground offensive in the city where famine is taking place. While the IDF has been building up its plans for a major offensive in Gaza City, its forces have been on the offensive since about August 10th. The first part of the offensive was primarily targeted at the Zitnun neighborhood, which was reduced to ruins within a few weeks. Israel's offensive has expanded to other neighborhoods, and there have been reports of the IDF using tanks, explosive-laden armored vehicles, and grenades dropped from drones to destroy homes and tents. And by the way, the explosive-laden vehicles, I talked about this a while back. I reported on it at, I believe, the Institute. It's something that, hasn't gotten any attention. But Israel is using car bombs. They are putting a bunch of explosives in older armored vehicles using a remote-controlled operating system to drive them to wherever they want an explosion, and that's what they're using to blow up areas of Gaza. Just absolutely disgusting. So Dave says here that at least 1,100 Palestinians have been killed and 600 wounded over the past 20 days in Gaza. All right, so next up here, this is an article I wrote for JudgeNap.com on September 4th. Netanyahu's likely pick for Shin Bet chief opposes ending war in Gaza. So Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu is likely to make Captain David Zini the next chief of the Israeli security agency Shin Bet. People who know Zini say he's an extremist. So this is from Haaretz. Zini also praises religious extremism. He says Messianism is not a dirty word, and opposes ending the war in the Gaza Strip based on the same messianic worldview, saying this is the eternal war. It is hardly surprising then that he is the only senior officer among the IDF general staff that has adopted Netanyahu's slogan of total victory. In recent weeks, Haaretz has spoken with dozens of acquaintances, subordinates, top brass, and friends of Zini over the years who offered crucial insight into him and his inner circle. He did not respond for a response for this article. The conversations reveal that some of the people who know him best are precisely those most concerned about his expected appointment at the Shin Bet. Indeed, several senior army officers, past and present, described him in similar terms: a dogmatic thinker, prone to seeing things in black and white, and convinced every problem can be solved with force. One source said Zini's extremism limited his career advancement. The chief of staff always avoided giving him a significant command role because of his nationalist temperament and extremism are well known to everyone. Netanyahu, who has appointed several extremists to his administration, Israeli Finance Minister Bezalel Smotrich has called for starving the entire population of Gaza to death, and National Security Minister Itamar Ben-Gvir has called for the execution of Palestinian captives to resolve the prison overcrowding problem. And let's talk about those captives quickly. Only 1 in 4 Palestinians detained by Israel are militants. And so this was some reporting done by Yuval Abraham, the director of the Oscar-winning documentary, No Other Land. And he said, based on the numbers that they have, 1 in 4 of the Palestinians held by Israel in detention facilities are by Israel's own admission, not militants. They are innocent civilians. All right, next up here, this one, Dave DeCamp, September 4th, antiwar.com. Israel's defense minister again threatens to unleash biblical plagues on Yemen. So this is Israel Katz on X. The Houthis are firing missiles at Israel again. A plague of darkness, a plague of the firstborn. We will compete all 10 plagues. This man is an absolute lunatic, and yet he is in charge of the Israeli military. Highly, highly disturbing. And the last article here today, Yemeni drone hits Israel's Ramon airport. So a drone fired from Yemen hit the Ramon airport in southern Israel on Sunday as the Houthis, officially known as Ansar Allah, continue their attacks in response to the Israeli genocidal war and blockade on the Gaza Strip. According to the Israeli military, the drone hit a passenger terminal at the airport and shrapnel lightly injured a 63-year-old man who was taken to the hospital along with the woman who fell while running from the scene. The IDF says investigating why the drone wasn't intercepted by air defenses. The Houthi military spokesman took credit for the attack, saying a drone targeted the Ramon airport, which, by Allah's grace, directly hit the airport and caused the airport to shut down and halt air traffic. The spokesman also announced several other drone attacks, but there were no indications that any struck their targets. The last Houthi attack comes after the Israeli military assassinated the prime minister of the Houthi-led Sana'a-based Yemeni government. The Israeli defense minister, Israel Katz, has been threatening Yemen with biblical plagues, signaling Israel's wants to escalate attacks on the country. At this point, I wonder if, maybe the Israeli military is struggling to keep up with all the wars that its government wants it to wage, whether that be in Israel, against the Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza, in Syria, in Lebanon, in Iran, or in Yemen. All right, that will do it for the show. Thank you all so much for tuning in to today's program. We will be back with another episode on Thursday, so be sure to subscribe to this channel, the channel for the Kyle Anzalone Show, and also check out our sponsor, ExpatMoneySummit.com.